what is revolution and why. And we're really thankful that Professor Higginson is accepted to come here and talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I also want to announce that, by the way, my name is Stellan Windhagen. I'm the director of the Resistance Studies Initiative. We've had a number of seminars during the fall, and we also have one extra that is happening tomorrow, which is then with Tim Wallis, who has been instrumental in the work against nuclear weapons. And what you might know is the unique international ban on nuclear weapons now that came into effect this year. So actually nuclear weapons in, for example, United States are today illegal. So that seminar tomorrow will talk about, so what do we do about it? Because obviously the United States government is not going to take away the nuclear weapons just because they are declared illegal. So the question is, what can we do? So that the seminar tomorrow is about that. So you'll find information about that over there. You also find some of our propaganda material, which is then the Journal of Resistance Studies, which we are actually giving out for free if you're interested. It's also possible to download on the internet. It's the first journal in the world that is focused on resistance. And we send around a sign-up sheet here, so if people want to be part of our listserv, because we're trying to be like a clearinghouse, giving people information about all kinds of things happening that has to do with resistance studies. So please sign up on the listserv if you're interested in that. We're making sure that you don't get a lot of extra emails, spams, but only about resistance studies. All right, so with that, again, I want to say so much welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So we give the floor to you, and after that there are questions and comments. Hopefully we will engage in a discussion about revolution.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stellan. I'm going to try to talk for just about 31 minutes. I'm hoping that this does not turn out to be a long, boring saga. If it does, you certainly can politely leave, and I won't be offended. So, what I'm going to talk about are two types of revolutions, because I think that failed revolutions or revolutionary situations are understudied. The Catalonian uprising of 1907, for example, which a lot has been written about, but a long time ago. So I'm going to talk about contingently successful revolutions and revolutionary situations without revolutionary outcomes. The formal title of the paper, which is a think paper at the moment, it's in process, so to speak, is Why or Why Not Revolution? Some Thoughts on Unexpected Turns in the Modern Era. In the preface to his account of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky states, "The most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historic events. In ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation and history is made by specialists in that line of business: kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. But at those crucial moments, when the old order is no longer endurable, they break over the barriers excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime." So that's Trotsky from this 3-volume history of the Russian Revolution. The prolific late historian of the French Revolution, Richard Cobb, takes exception. "One must consider thirst, hunger, drought, envy, social resentment, boredom, hatred, malice, distress, failure, poverty, hope, panic, and fear as alternate stimulations for revolt, as well as the idea that if a revolutionary situation is prolonged, other fears will arise to divide the ranks of potential revolutionaries, to devour the moderates, and to frighten to the side of repression those who are alarmed by the spectacle of prolonged and senseless violence, disorder, and damage to property, causing the revolt to lose momentum. Cobb also notes the harsh reality of revolution in stories of poverty, starvation, and despair. He also notes, quote, the commonest cause of a riot accidentally developing into a revolutionary situation is either the overuse or underuse of the repressive powers of government. My objective is to examine why economic conjuncture, in combination with weak or dependent state formations, has often induced popular instances of rebellion and revolution in the 20th century. I will also examine why revolutions do not always usher in genuine social reform. I am particularly focused or I was. No, this is most embarrassing. Page 2, oh no, here, yeah. I am particularly focused on comparative models of social change and revolution found in the works of Crane Brenton, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, Richard Cobb, Eric Hobsbawm, Barrington Moore, Edmund Morgan, James Scott, and William T. Vollman. I am also concerned to identify the circumstances that gave rise to sustained grievances, many of which last for generations, among beleaguered groups and dependent social classes in countries as disparate as France, Russia, China, and South Africa, although today we're only going to be dealing with 2 of those places. Secondly, I examine how some social groupings were either transformed or obliterated by popular protest, rebellion, and revolution. Finally, I will examine the differential capacity of dependent social classes to engage in political action. Revolutions and collective violence can only happen once large numbers of people with access to weapons and a modicum of social power or political enfranchisement began to feel a daily psychological discomfort with the way the existing political order interprets and caters for their expectations, as the Mexican Revolution certainly demonstrates. As the Mexican Revolution demonstrates, regional elites with few national interlocutors can occasionally trigger this kind of violence. This is also largely what happened during the failed white rural rebellion of 1914 in South Africa, which I'll come back to since that's what I know most about. That's the country I know most about, besides my own. Regional elites moved seamlessly from passive non-compliance with the central government to more aggressive forms of protest, once they came to believe that the central government did not care about them, and even worse, had sold them out to American and British imperial interests, respectively. Revolutions and collective violence do not happen all the time. Rather, they tend to concentrate in large waves or clusters and then subside for substantial periods of time. Often the very same people who engaged in devastating attacks on persons and property and other atrocious forms of mass violence will return to a more apparently pacific relationship with their victims afterwards, at least for a while. Tracing, you can think about the former Yugoslavia in that respect, which we might talk about as well. Tracing the specific peaks and trials of collective violence boils down to stipulating what kind of social processes intervene between the acquisition of a violence-promoting set of ideas and having a direct hand in causing them. The irony in these social processes is that promoters of violent ideals usually have to convince others, usually the young and the hapless, to kill, maim, and terrorize on their behalf and that of the ideals they espouse. Precisely because the perpetrators are young, they do not always consider the precise nature of the payoff. In a longer version of this paper, I use instances of collective violence as barometers of popular allegiance to state power. Since violence of this nature is often the result of a state defending the quote-unquote beneficiaries of inequality from challenges by victims of inequality, end of quote. And that's from Charles Tilly's The Politics of Collective Violence. I ask a number of questions about my sources. When, how, and under what kind of circumstances was the inherent violence of everyday life transformed into sustained murderous bursts of hostility? Were these outbursts emblematic of the everyday tenor of life? What kind of expectations had to be present or absent among the perpetrators and victims? What forms did these flashpoints assume? In other words, did they start as a riot, a protest, a popular protest of some kind, or what have you? Finally, and most important, what happened after the violence subsided? How then does one come to reconcile the paradoxical nature of the moral and strategic value of revolutions and revolutionary situations against the existing political and social order? This problem is as old as the societies that created the Christian and Hebrew scriptures. Let us take two examples. A passage from the little Bible of the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, and the exhortation of Christ shortly after he had preached the Sermon on the Mount. First, Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn. Now, Matthew 10, verses 34 and 36. This is Jesus Christ speaking. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance with his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Let us now imagine the impact of these words on, say, Martin Luther just before he tacked his 95 Theses to the door of the cathedral at Wittenberg on 31 October 1517. A German peasant in the midst of the Bauernkrieg, or Peasants' War, 17 years later. An Aztec or Indian Christian convert in the aftermath of their respective countries' violent conquest in the name of the same Habsburg emperor who excommunicated Martin Luther with the Edict of Worms. The 1 in 10 African-American slave in the United States who was literate on the eve of the Civil War. And finally, young Addie Mae Collins, the night before she was blown to bits at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Most of us are not compelled to think about such matters in our daily lives. It is too distracting, too inconvenient. However, we must begin to do so, if only because we live in an age where quote-unquote normal has become extremely contingent. The late historical sociologist Barrington Moore noted, and I quote, "Normality has to be recreated anew in each generation, often with great pain and suffering. To maintain and transmit a value system, human beings are punched, bullied, sent to jail, thrown into concentration camps, cajoled, bribed, made into heroes, encouraged to read newspapers, stood up against a wall and shot, and even to learn sociology. To speak of normality is to overlook the concrete interests and privileges that are served by indoctrination, education, and the entire complicated process of transmitting culture from one generation to the next." So what about revolutions then? Revolutionary situations can often end tragically, where the leadership lags behind the great mass of participants in political awareness. Such instances are the stuff of great novels and memoirs, such as Vittorio de Lampedusa's The Leopard, Chinua Achebe's A Man of the People, René Depestre's King Christophe, and Zhao Ziyang's Prisoner of the State. Apart from the proxy wars generated by the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States and the NATO powers, the 20th century was rife with revolutionary situations without revolutionary outcomes. Kenya and Algeria in the 1950s and 60s, Peru, Uruguay, and Chile from 1968 to 1973, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Chad, and Oman from 1964 to 1970, and Grenada, Guyana, Colombia, Iran, Trinidad, and Venezuela from 1970 to 1980. World War I was the catalyst for all of this in many respects. World War I saw the total breakdown of the patchwork compromise of the Western powers that had been created in the 19th century, while opening the door for revolutions in which millions of people participated, and also for more well-armed and well-organized fascist movements that threatened to transform mass political participation into an exercise in killing and death rather than hope for the future. American intervention in Mexico in 1916 and in Haiti in 1914 were high points in a trend that has been sustained right through the present engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 20th century was the most violent century in human history to date. Between 1900 and 1999, 250 wars of an international and civil nature were prosecuted. 2 or 3 big wars per year, in other words. On average, these produced about 1 million deaths per year. Altogether, about 100 million people were killed in the 20th century as a direct result of action organized by one government or another. Another 100 million civilians died of war-induced diseases and other indirect effects. I know these numbers sort of boggle the mind and your eyes glaze over, but still you have to remember that these are people that we're talking about. The 2 world wars were important moments in mass violence. Battle deaths in World War I amounted to about 10 million across all theaters of war, not counting the extermination of discrete civilian populations such as the 1 million to 1.5 million Armenians exterminated in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps as many as 200,000 Jews and Romani or Gypsies in Romania, Lithuania, and other parts of Eastern Europe. Even though massive interstate wars produce most of the world's political deaths, deliberate efforts of state authorities to eliminate, displace, or control subordinate populations, particularly in the most economically backward portions of the industrial countries, such as the American South before, say, the 1970s, and in their colonies also accounted for a significant number of the century's deaths. They also established a precedent that was typically realized once war broke out. The ruthlessness with which the representatives of the industrial countries put down rebellions in the Congo, Burma, or India came back to haunt them during the course of the two world wars. France, for example, deployed 200,000 African troops on European battlefields during the First World War. At the war's end, France's African troops were deployed to the German Ruhr Valley and the Rhine to put down insurrectionary strikes by German coal miners and metal workers. Contact between African soldiers and German workers did not always have the desired outcome, but both groups learned from each other, even while they contended with each other. State-sponsored violence moved in two directions: toward increasing deadliness in international conflicts and toward a propensity to put down mass domestic demonstrations of grievance with occasional deadly force. Both trends anticipated the monopolization of the means of violence by the state during the prosecution of war and also during peacetime. Such a monopoly in a modern state required the appearance of a general consensus of the population on the right of the state to exercise such violence. The aristocratic leaders of the Entente, the Ottoman Sultan, the German Kaiser, and the Austrian Emperor, and also the Russian Tsar on the side of the Allies, failed to grasp this elementary lesson of modern statecraft. Hence, they were overthrown. The war, therefore, proved to be their undoing. Let us examine two contingently successful examples of revolution: the Russian and the Mexican revolutions. Leon Trotsky also observed, with regard to the Russian Revolution, and this is in volume 1 of the cheap paperback by Orbis Press, only on the basis of a study of political processes in the masses themselves can we understand the role of parties and leaders, whom we least of all are inclined to ignore. Without a guiding organization, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam not enclosed in a piston box. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, but the steam. During the first few weeks of the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917, the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Revolutionary Socialists threw their support to the idea of workers' control of industry, or quote unquote, all power to the Soviets, in order to consolidate and direct the momentum of the popular support for greater mass control over the state and industry. At the time that the leading men grouped around Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin, were not entirely sure of what Soviet power would entail. When Lenin and other exiles returned shortly after the February Revolution, the cry everywhere, on the battlefields, on the streets of Petrograd and Moscow, and in the countryside, was bread, land, and peace, as opposed to all power to the Soviets. Yet by October 1917, a month before the Bolshevik seizure, 4/5 of the factories in basic industry, including the giant Putilov steel works in Petrograd, were being run by various factory committees of workers of various political persuasions. Bolsheviks did not always form the majority in these factory committees. In fact, in some of the larger factories, they were a distinct minority, Putilov being the most striking exception. The disadvantages to this arrangement were obvious to any group that aspired to run a modern state during a period of bewildering upheaval. Without establishing consistent lines of communication to the factory committees, and without an overall plan of production which would affect the administration of each factory. The idea of literal workers' control threatened to regress into total anarchy. On balance, however, despite the obvious difficulties, Lenin, now at the helm of the government, appeared to support workers' control. When he appeared before the Petrograd Soviet a month before the Bolsheviks seized power, he said, and I quote, "The key to the matter will not lie in the confiscation of capitalist property, but in the statewide, all-embracing workers' control over the capitalists and their supporters. By confiscation alone, you will accomplish nothing, for in that there is no element of organization, of accounting, of correct distribution." Workers' control for Lenin meant control by the Soviets, not what he called the, quote, ridiculous passing of the railroads into the hands of railway men, the leather factories into those of leather workers. Lenin was concerned that workers learn how to administer and organize a factory comprehensively, and with concern for the overall movement of the economy. Workers' control was not simply expropriation, but bookkeeping, inspection of accounting procedures, and devices. All of the practices that would enable the proletariat to oversee the bourgeoisie while learning how to eventually replace them. In fact, Lenin was biding his time. He and those around him knew that a revolution in Russia alone could not secure socialism, and that if the workers of the more industrialized country, then on the battlefields of World War I, did not turn their rifles on their officers and then their employers when they returned home, all was lost. Revolution in the rest of the industrial world, including the United States, was his chief preoccupation. Revolution in Russia was at best a prelude or first act. Now, Mexico. Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship came to a protracted end in 1910, although revisionist historians of the Mexican Revolution now begin to think of the revolution as starting not in 1910-11, but in 1905, and we can talk about that during question and answer period. I'm running over my 31 minutes a little bit, but please excuse me. So, Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship came to a protracted end in 1910. 1% of the population owned 97% of the land, while 96% of the population owned only 1% of the land. Land ownership was typically of the latifundista type, organized on haciendas, many of which were 10 to 12,000 acres. The hacienda was not only a large landholding system, but also a social system, an entire universe in which one landowner might have the power of life and death over tens of thousands of campesinos or peasants who he had no personal knowledge of. The population of the haciendas, whether they were sharecropping peasant, peon, or agricultural laborer, ranch hand, mason, or carpenter, lacked the most basic civil and human rights. Their lack of land of their own seconded their lack of civil rights. These conditions sparked the armed, apparently spontaneous mass uprisings that engulfed rural communities for more than a decade, and which caused alarm not only among the haciendados, or landowners, but also among their creditors across the border in the United States. Hence Pershing's invasion of Mexico in 1916-1917. A great revolutionary wave swept the country for a decade and came to be embodied in the personalities and political activities of three men: Venustiano Carranza, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata. Villa in the north, in Chihuahua and Durango, Zapata in Morelos in the south, and Carranza waiting in the wings and promising everything to everybody without fulfilling any of them. Was there a larger field that we have to construct, that we have to reconstruct first before we can see why the aggrieved parties in these two examples chose to act violently? Violence and aggression in any society embrace related problems of social and political cost, morality, social cohesion, and authority, as I alluded to earlier on. In short, who, through the agency of the state or its functional equivalent, can legitimately do violence to other people? Because there is no known human society in which violence and aggression do not occur, and because the range of expression of aggression can also vary, from a hostile glance to the extermination of entire segments of a population, it is more useful to think of violence, particularly revolutionary or fascist violence, in terms of capacities rather than instincts. And we can talk about that during question and answer. Actual acts of terror and violence only amount to the most obvious aspect of this problem. One must reconstruct why an act of violence occurred by putting its details into a relationship that is consistent with the aims of the perpetrators and the amount of force that a given state might impose upon them before, during, and after the act was completed. Assuming that collective violence is gratuitous is almost always a serious error of political judgment. War has often opened up political space for revolutionary activity by that portion of a given society with the greatest grievances and significant measures of what we might call tactical social power. If stresses on the central government and its armed forces compromise their decision-making capacity, the field of revolutionary forces will broaden dramatically. However, if in the course of popular protest and direct action, the revolutionary forces exhaust their social power too quickly, or if they are not sufficiently organized to include larger numbers of people from different social strata under their banner, they will quickly lose their chance to transform social power into popular sovereignty. Russia, during the First World War, was a successful example of this formula, while Mexico was not. Thank you.